Hello everyone, it's George from Ireland. Thank you for coming back to my channel. This video is about Western betrayal, particularly betrayal by the United States of Ukraine. And has already happened in that some of the military aid has been cut off. Now, Joe Biden didn't do enough, at least he did something. Trump in his first term was not as bad towards Ukraine as many feared, as I did. He certainly wasn't as good as he should have been. Of course, if he armed Ukraine properly, this war never would have started. And of course, the United States does have an obligation to arm Ukraine because of the Budapest Memorandum. The United States and indeed the United Kingdom are guarantors of that Ukraine gave its nuclear arsenal up to the Russian Federation for free in return for security guarantees, Russia recognizing Ukraine's borders. And so that was it. Crimea is most definitely legally part of Ukraine, and Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk and Lugansk, all the regions that Russia claims to have annexed. In fact, the last four, Russia doesn't even control the whole region. So because it was American policy, nuclear non-proliferation, and if they couldn't have as few sovereign states as possible owning nuclear weapons. And obviously the Ukrainians are kicking themselves now. Some are saying, well, if we don't get security guarantees, we have to develop nuclear weapons as the only way to stop Russia attacking us again, because can they take that risk that we drop a nuke on Moscow? Anyway, so Trump has agreed to meet Putin in Saudi Arabia. Now, these Gulf Arab states, they have played honest broker in quite a few of the prisoner exchanges, Qatar and United Arab Emirates, and indeed in getting some of the child hostages released, over 20,000 Ukrainian children kidnapped by Russia. Despite living parents, good parents in some cases. Sometimes they're taken from orphanages. Sometimes the parents were duped. They were told that in illegally occupied Ukraine, the Russian authorities would take them for a summer camp, and they just never brought them back, having their names changed, being given false identity documents, false dates of birth, so that the parents find it impossible to trace them. So the children, if they're young enough, will forget their true identities, to Russify them, attempting the erasure of their national identity and force feeding them Russia hyper-nationalist propaganda. So even meeting Putin is a bit of a coup for Putin. And so it shows you how imbecilic Trump is. Like, he was so moronic to agree to meet Kim Jong-un with nothing in return, which is something the North Korean regime had craved for decades. No North Korean leader had ever met a sitting US president. They'd met a quondam US president, Jimmy Carter, who's just died. So Trump could have said to President Putin, well, I will meet you on condition you do this, you release these people, or you have a 3-day ceasefire, withdraw from wherever. But he didn't do any of that in a supposed rush to have peace. And he's shown desperation. So that if you're at the other side knows you're desperate, they know they can charge a very, very high price indeed. Now, failing to arm Ukraine will not end the war, but it will end Ukraine. Obviously, Trump is correct on one thing. For decades, European NATO countries have not spent a sufficient amount on their defense. There was a 2% NATO target. And before this war, of the roughly 30 European NATO countries, very, very few of them were meeting that. Now, about half of them meeting it now, some of them significantly exceeding it, particularly the ones closest to Russia, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. Remember, their erstwhile Soviet republics, and indeed Poland, which had a lot of its territory stolen by the USSR in 1939. And obviously, the eastern half of Poland was under Russian rule for about a century. So it's all very worrisome meeting them there. And obviously, as Zelensky is quite correct, saying there can be no agreement about Ukraine without Ukraine. So they've got to be there. And obviously, one of the best strategies to do in any situation, conflictual situation, is to divide your enemies. So Putin, he will use weasel words as Trump, promise him whatever, get the US to cut off military aid. That'll sufficiently enfeeble Ukraine. And as just as it's going really badly for Russia, that they're scarcely crawling forward, their casualties have mounted. Looks like they're going to have to start conscripting significant number of people in Moscow, which they've really striven to avoid. Their interest rate is at 21%. Their inflation is really bad. They've got labor shortages, partly by their idiotic xenophobic policy, making it much more difficult for guest workers to come, who usually come from former Soviet republics like Uzbekistan. So it was just piling up. They were not going to be able to maintain this tempo of offensive throughout the whole year. it was going to slow down a bit in March anyway with the thaw and the mud, and then probably speed up again in May. But they just wouldn't really have the numbers as the North Koreans were withdrawn from the line of battle. There's talk that they're back now, so that wasn't really working for them. They've had so many pieces of equipment destroyed. They were reduced to using civilian vehicles and so on. They were not going to be able to exploit any breakthrough in the Ukrainian lines. So Ukraine had a real chance this year. And some of the American generals and defense officials were correct that there's no way that Ukraine is going to recover Crimea in the foreseeable future. I mean, I can't tell you what's going to happen in 20 years, but it was unhelpful to say that, demoralizing for the Ukrainians, a fillip to Russian morale, and in a sense, it undermined their negotiating position. So they've already had this phone call and got nothing in return for it. So yeah, it's all terribly worrying. Now, European countries, they could, of course, afford to arm Ukraine fully, but obviously they're too stingy, they're too purblind, they're too short-sighted. That Ukraine is the front line of Europe, and if Ukraine wins, Russia won't attack any other country. But if Ukraine loses, they will. So it's obviously very much in everybody's interest that they should do that. And countries like Sweden, which is entirely surrounded by NATO countries, should give most of its assets to Ukraine. They've got land borders with Norway and Finland, and they haven't fought either of those for centuries. They've got maritime borders, say Poland and Denmark, and they haven't fought either of those ones for centuries. So, the Baltic is a NATO lake, so they could afford to give away so much to Russia, or to Russia, forgive me, to Ukraine to stop Russia. And they have given away some equipment, but really just not enough. And Trump is on the money when he says that European countries, they want to spend on the nice stuff, the high benefits payments, the pensions, publicly funded healthcare, higher education, and so forth. But that leaves very little money left over for military hardware or the salaries of military personnel. And why should the United States do this? Well, because the United States considers it beneficial to themselves. Why do they have hundreds of military bases at all? It's not just out of the goodness of their heart, because they recognize their opponents of theirs, like China and the Russian Federation. The United States will be able to trade with these countries, will not be subjugated by countries that are hostile, talk about shared values. Now, things that people have said, like that Hegseth or J.D. Vance said, are not always wrong about incipient leftist totalitarianism in Western Europe. Now, they're not going to go full totalitarian, but there are worrying trends, just like there was a very troubling developments in the United States under Donald Trump, like the war on truth and his trying to pack the civil service with placemen. I mean, I realize that he's allowed to do that. So anyway, what Trump is doing is enfeebling NATO, and the United States has no longer got strategic ambiguity. If there was a ceasefire, permanent peace, if there was some sort of buffer zone, there could be NATO troops in there. The United States could say, oh, well, we might send troops, even though they've got no intention of doing so, just at least to leave that illusion, that possibility on the table. Okay, so the Russians are not quite sure what you're going to do. So therefore, they have to be a bit circumspect. And you've already removed that possibility. So it's making it a lot easier for them. And obviously making that far trickier for the Ukrainians. And if Ukraine is defeated, in a sense, that's a defeat for the United States. I know the USA is not actually fighting this war, but it was US policy to save Ukraine, and it will have failed. So Trump will be a loser. He'll be a Neville Chamberlain, and so on. With the case of Neville Chamberlain, there was at least a chance of peace, and the United Kingdom would have lost against Germany. So France would have lost against Germany in 1938. Whereas we know there is no chance of peace with between Putin and Ukraine if he thinks he can defeat Ukraine. And we know that NATO could definitely defeat Russia. The Russian Federation can't even defeat Ukraine, despite an almost 4-to-1 advantage in population. As like 10-to-1 advantage economically, had a 10-to-1 advantage in planes, in helicopters, and howitzers, in tanks, and armored personnel carriers, in infantry fighting vehicles, in almost everything. Admittedly, couldn't bring those all to bear in the war zone for logistical reasons. Had other frontiers to guard. But obviously, because Putin wouldn't try and take on the whole of NATO, try and take on the smaller states like Estonia, assuming Article 5 wouldn't pertain, they'd back out of it. Anyway, thank you so much for watching my channel. Make sure you subscribe on Patreon, donate to PayPal, georgecallahan79@gmail.com. Toodaloo.